Great, welcome everyone. So I have 6:01 on my clock, and to be respectful of Dr. Rocos and everyone else who's on time, let's go ahead and get started. On behalf of my fellow co-hosts who are on today, specifically Dr. Alex Mamagani of Switzerland and Dr. Amna Hussein at the University of Arizona, I'd like to welcome you all to this week's Virtual Global Spine Conference. I'm so glad to invite my partner this week, Dr. Brett Rocos, who's been with us at Duke for about the past year or so. And really over this first year of his tenure, he's really distinguished himself as a truly remarkable deformity surgeon and thought expert. So I was really excited to see his topic this week, namely safer deformity surgery, because as I've done less and less of these cases, I find them harder and harder, bloodier and, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really excited to hear his perspectives of how to make it better and safer for all of our patients. So Dr. Rocos, please take it away, and thanks so much for being here.
No problem. Thanks very much for having me, Dr. Than, and welcome everybody this evening. Having looked back at the last, even just the last few weeks of the Virtual Global Spine Conference, it's an absolute honor to be here. And being British, that's not something I say lightly. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I am very grateful. And thanks for the education that the BGSC has offered us all since COVID struck, and we're all indebted to you. As Dr. Than explains, I'm Brett Rocos. As you can tell, I'm from Britain. I'm a British-trained spine surgeon, completed my fellowships at the University of Toronto, and have been here at Duke for the last year with some really exceptional colleagues. And compared to them, I am but a grasshopper at their knee. But one thing I think I'm able to contribute is some thoughts about safer deformity surgery. So this is me, and my disclosures are really quite limited. And I just want to stress that the views today are my own, really, and in no way representative of Duke University or Duke University hospitals. So what I'd like to try and share with you today is about patient safety in a spine-specific environment. And in a rather unusual twist, I'm going to tell you the answer to begin with before looking at 4 areas where I think we can develop our ideas in spine surgery in a bit more detail. And this is the sort of patient that we're looking at, and this is someone you might argue foolishly, attempted to tackle just a few weeks ago. And you can imagine the number of safety issues that this patient presents, a 70-year-old lady with a raft of comorbidities and a pain pump in situ. And this is the best standing that she could offer. Now, we've all seen patients like this, and immediately I'm willing to bet most of you are starting to think, oh, well, I'll osteotomy here, screw there, maybe some traction. Have they done all the conservative treatment options? The answer is yes, they did. What am I going to do with the pain pump? Some of you are already calculating in your mind the technical aspects of looking after this patient. But safety factors into everything, and we need to bear that in mind from the moment you meet this patient to the moment they're discharged from your care. So having moved to the States, one thing I've learned amongst thousands of things is that your medical license certificates are far more spectacular than we have in Europe. And this is our one from North Carolina that I keep on the wall to remind me how lucky I am to be here every day. And if you zoom in on the badge or the seal, primum non nocere, which is something we learned from the start, which is first do no harm. And that's literally in the middle of the certificates hanging in the office in front of me now. So it really is a fundamental tenet of what we do, that we first don't injure our patients. And that goes right the way back to classical antiquity in Greece. We say it, we think it, but how much are we employing that in every interaction and everything we do in the office every day? In common with most of you, we all have our own medical heroes. Of course, Dr. Than is my first medical hero, but my second is this chap, Joseph Lister, who's from Britain, and many of you will know was really the pioneer of aseptic surgery. And really, it's a very visible example of how someone, would not give in to the idea of high-risk operations and what they were doing, and had a singular quest to improve the safety of his patients. And he transformed surgery from really a bit of a roll of the dice, not even that good, you might argue, and being unable to enter body cavities and so on, to be able to operate on Queen Victoria and let her survive. And you can imagine the 1800s, that was a high-risk procedure. It's a history worth reading because he was dismissed at many times by many of the leading lights in surgery, not just in Britain, but across here in the States. But he pursued, and now we all remember him, not least of all because some of us will be using Listerine, which is a product of his, but also everything we do to fight infection in the OR and afterwards is really down to his work. I'm going to start by saying that saying you're a safe surgeon and making safety the absolute center of what you're doing is not a weakness. It does not make you a surgeon who's afraid, a surgeon who's not innovative, a surgeon who's unwilling to take risk. It just means you're considerate at every stage of the way. So for those of you who in your mind are like, yeah, cool, I'm safe, but it stymies my ability to come up with creative solutions, it's just not true. Safety is not weakness. Okay, so I just want you to remember that as we move through some of these ideas. Most of you will say, I'm already safe. I don't really have safety issues. I'm sorry to tell you that you're just wrong. We know that from that report to Err is Human back in 1999, which is from the Institute of Medicine, such as it was here, that 10% of patients in the US health system suffer from medically preventable errors. And that's reflected across the world. That's not just unique to the United States. Certainly it applies in Britain. And we audited that back in 2010, and the rate was just under 10%. Everything we do is risky, yes, but every step we take can be modified. We do risky stuff all the time, crossing the road, getting on a plane, eating a burger, drinking a beer, all these sorts of things. But we make steps to try and maximize the safety in that. This is Carl Lewis, who I remember as a kid, essentially winning everything in 1992. And realistically, although he was the world champion at everything he turned his hand to, he was always looking to be getting better. And we need to do the same thing. So yeah, you're probably already quite safe. But do you really think you can't get any safer with the sorts of things you're doing? Are you really sure about that if you're saying yes? Well, look, here's the answer to how to be safe. You don't want to do safe things. You need to be the safer surgeon. Many of you will have looked at this book by James Clear, who's a guy who got his face smashed in and a brain injury from a baseball bat when he was very young, and developed a process of developing habits during his recovery. And he talks in chapter 2 of this book about being the safer person, or being the person you want to be. So when you're working to develop safety in your practice, don't do safe things or think, how can I influence safety? Be the person who's going to be the safe surgeon. Always ask yourself, what would the safe surgeon do in this situation, right the way from walking in the clinic room until discharging your patient to wherever they're going to go. Something I often say to myself, and I've said to my resident, even in the last 24 hours, is try and listen to the future you. Try and think to yourself, what am I going to be saying to myself in a week's time about what I do in the next 2 minutes? Am I going to wish that I'd drawn a line under this procedure here? Am I going to wish that I revised this screw? Am I going to wish I undid some of the correction to bring those MEPs back? Am I going to wish that I'd stopped and came back another day? So always ask yourself, what's future Brett, or whatever your name is, going to be saying to myself today? Develop safe habits. Okay, our lives are a constellation of habits that we've developed over long and winding training under a variety of mentors. And so you need to evolve those habits. And this is what habits look like. And again, James Clear talks about this, and many of you will have read Atul's books about getting better and complications and so on. And he talks a little bit about this as well. Every heuristic we have in surgery, we can't possibly think of each of them de novo. So we develop these habits right the way through. I always pick up the litter on my OR room floor. I can't bear it. It's a habit now. And I can't operate until I do that. I don't know why I do that. I think I'm worried about slipping over. But there's a cue. I see the litter on the floor, and I can't stop myself from picking it up. The response is, I've got a tidy OR, and the reward is, I feel at peace to go ahead with my operation. Now, if you think about applying that all the way through every step of your patient's journey, you always look at the lateral X-ray first, so you don't forget sagittal balance. You always check their indicators of nutritional status. You always look at their comorbidities and whether they smoke or not first. You'll slowly develop these heuristics to be a safer surgeon. And that's where Atul's book talks about, developing these skills and coming up with new ones and really bringing them into your day. And if you haven't read James Clear's book, it's not specific to medicine, but it is an interesting way to look at what we do. The reward is the challenging bit, I always think, in surgery, because yeah, we'll always get to the end of an operation one way or the other, right? It's a bit like saying bleeding always stops. Yeah, it does. Okay, and it's a good thing when it does, but not always. And I sometimes struggle to think, what is my reward for doing this well? Most patients probably do all right. In deformity, I think it's slightly different. We know from the SRS data, somewhere between 6 and 8 out of 10 in these very complex patients develop a complication that threatens them in some way. Now, sadly, in the sort of work we're doing, that complication can be very severe, such as dense neurologic deficit, right the way through to not surviving. So I think it's slightly easier for us in deformity to keep an eye on the reward, i.e. they walk out of hospital alive. But for the rest of us doing, degenerative work or outpatient surgery, sometimes the reward for developing good safety habits is a bit more challenging to see. And it's quite personal. So have a think, what's important to you? What makes you feel like a good doctor? And like I say to the residents, what's going to make you phone your mum and say, hey, mum, I saved a life today? The last principle I'm going to tell you about the answers is the 1%. These are two of the greats of the athletic world. The chap on the left is Ben Pekulski, the best bodybuilder in history to never have won Mr. Olympia. And the chap on the right is David Brailsford, who was the British cycling coach brought in 2006-ish to develop British cycling. In the 100 years before then, Britain had won one gold medal in the 92 Olympics for cycling. When he arrived, we won essentially every medal going across the Olympics, World Championships, and everything. And both these characters talked about the 1%, getting 1% better every day. And they described it as the aggregation of marginal gains. Each little step you take on their own has a very small impact. If you gain 1 pound in weight today, that's not a big deal. You drink 2 beers rather than 1, not a big deal. But you do that every day or every week, before you know it, the impact is enormous. And that's what the Pac-Man, as he liked to be known, and David Brailsford talked about, was each of those builds on, and before you know it, you've done everything and you've won and you're a safe surgeon. Some of you will have seen the S3P project that Dr. Vitali up in New York runs, the Safety and Spine Surgery Summit. If you haven't seen it, I strongly recommend you take a look at this website. There are a lot of resources here for developing patient safety. Some need updating, but all of them are relevant, and they're particularly useful here are the guidelines in loss of signals in your operating room. And they run a conference every year, which is usually very good. They certainly used to post the videos online. Hopefully they will do again this year. But I recommend you check this for resources to improve the safety in your work. The last sort of more generic thing I wanted to bring your attention to was this idea from the Institute of Safe Medication Practices. It's slightly wordy, but it applies to us. There is a hierarchy in achieving safe practice. Just educating people and saying, don't hit the dura again, be more careful, is the least effective way of bringing about safety in your operating room or in a particular discipline. The most safe way, you can see at the top of the arrow, is forcing the function. Don't expose the dura unless you have to, and then you can't hit it. And everything in between, barriers and fail-safes, which we all do. I know Dr. Thurns talked about putting patties in the way of the dura when he's doing his decompressions. Or I know that he uses the robot and checks and triple check. I know because I've seen his plans on the robot that we have, checks and triple checks to make sure everything's there. So he's not even laid his hands on a patient before he knows precisely what he's going to do. So there's a barrier between him and the potential for harm. Protocols and standardizations apply to all of us in our institutions, and so on down. But you can see education, telling people, warning people are the least effective ways to be safe. So when you hit a safety problem or you observe something that could be improved, just telling people mind out for that is not going to work. You either remove it or you put something in the way of it. So that's worth thinking about. And that goes back again to the err is human back in 99. They came up with this idea. So in the last, 15 slides, there's been a whole bunch of errors in spellings and so on. Some of you will have seen them. Some of you won't have done. Each of them together, has actually compromised the comprehension of the slides. I appreciate English may not be the first, English is not the first language for pretty much anyone here. But, there are mistakes throughout that. Doesn't matter in a slide. But if that's my deformity and suddenly I've missed 4 screws, or I've misjudged 4 levels, or I have missed 400 mils of blood loss, that's a big deal. And the patient's life could be at stake from that. So just be mindful of all these details. So how about how we're going to progress? Well, the first thing to talk about is checklists. I'll say this, whatever you might think, checklists, they work. Full stop. It's incontrovertible. Okay, in 2009, when the World Health Organization, where I was working at the time, brought in the basic surgical checklist that hopefully we're all using, we certainly should be, we showed that mortality fell from 1.5% in elective surgery, regardless of your environment, from Southern Africa right the way through to MGH and everything in between. Not to suggest MGH is at the very top, of course Duke is, but you get the idea. Mortality fell 1.5% to 0.8%. Inpatient complications fell from 11 to 7% in the acute surgical patient, just using the safety checklist, which we're using every day. If you turn your attention to more specific checklists, like the spine, like focusing on spine, well, there's some work here from Kulkarni, which is worth reading. The spine surgical checklist that they've developed, they used in 410 patients before using it and 448 after development of the checklist. And they applied it in all ages and all surgeries, degenerative through deformity. The checklist is quite extensive. If you look at the paper, there's 16 preoperative ticks, 13 intraoperative ticks, and 8 postoperative ticks. It's quite long, I think, but still, we got time. The turnovers and so on allow for that. It significantly reduced preventable errors by 60% in their cohort, and statistically significantly reduced them. 55 of their cases were more than 3 levels of fusion. So, what we might term more complex surgery. 51% are, 51 of their cases afterwards were, and again, they're seeing a significant reduction in safety incidents, even with the complex cases. The majority were decompression alone, which shows it's effective regardless of the scale of your operation. Checklists work. They work in spine, they work in surgery in general. They definitely reduce system errors. That's how they function. If you think about your WHO checklist, it's checking stuff that really we shouldn't need to check. Have we got the right patient? Are the x-rays on the screen? Are the antibiotics given? But the fact is those mistakes account for a huge number of morbidities in the surgical patient. But they have to be usable. And some of the objections back in 2010, when Lord Darzi was pushing this forward and Liam Donaldson in Switzerland was pushing it forward, was it was just adding delays into surgery. Well, it's automatic for most of us now. It's not adding delays, okay? It's far slower to go back and have to revise a screw than it is to pause and just think, have we done everything? So my favorite astronaut is Buzz Aldrin. And I think Buzz Aldrin is an absolute legend because he's the only one who'll stand up and say what he did was really hard and frightening. And I've never met Buzz Aldrin, but I have got his autograph in a book in my office here, and I look at it sometimes. And the reason I often think of him is this is his glove from the Apollo 11 moonwalk in 1969. And on his glove is a checklist of things he had to do on the moon surface. Now, this is a man who essentially is a superhero who drilled over and over again, repeatedly, the same tasks, which when you think about it is not what we do. We do various things on various shaped people with various levels of deformity and degeneration. No two cases are the same. He did his EVA activities 1,000 times before he got on that ship. And he still had a checklist that he referred to. And I couldn't find the picture of him actually looking at it, but there is one. And they used it and used it and used it constantly. Okay, and this is a guy who's infallible in my mind. You can make your own checklists, and these are the checklists that I use in Duke OR. Okay, I have a little folder. I put the Red Bull Racing on there because Max Verstappen keeps winning, and it reminds me that to win, you've got to work really hard. And this is one of my reps who holds it up for me when I want to check something. I have a checklist when I set up in the OR to make sure everything on top of the WHO checklist is there something I can hit my head on? Have I made sure I've got some tilt on the table? Have I broken the table in the right place? Are the patient eyes free of contact? Make sure I put some tape over my mask so I don't mist up the microscope. Just small things, but I check it every time. And then on the right of that yellow divider there are my emergency checklists. What do I do when I hit the dura? What do I do when signals are lost? What do I do when I have unexpected large blood loss? And what do I run through with anesthetics if there's a problem? And each time I hit a snag, which fortunately is not too often, I turn to the right page. And you can do this too. You customize them for you. What is it that you think is important and you must not forget in any given situation, be it routine or emergency? But go beyond that and think, what about your day? I am not a morning person, but everybody else in America is. So I have a morning checklist. I go, right, Brett, when you get into the office at 6 a.m., you must check this, do this, check your in-basket, make sure, you've marked your patients for the day and so on, because I forget. You might be a morning person, not an evening person. So you might have an end of the day checklist type thing to make sure your patients are safe. Customize them for your environment. What works for me here at Duke is very different to what worked for me in London before, in Canada before that, in Africa before that, and so on. So it has to work with your environment and your teams. And equally for your practice. Not everyone will be doing deformity. That's cool. It is the best. You should be doing it, but not everyone is doing it. And so adjust them for your practice. If you have a high rate of turnover in your OR, you might need a turnover checklist posted on the door just to make sure you've got everything before you roll out and roll the next one in. Update them. My checklists, I have them on the computer. I try and update them as I learn new things. As I get new colleagues in the department, I add a new phone number to say, hey, this is the vascular surgeon's number. This is the, Dr. Than's OR day changed from Wednesday to Friday. So now on Fridays, I know he's in OR 48 and I could call him and hopefully he'd lend a hand. So keep them up to date and use them. It is not a weakness to use checklists. Buzz Aldrin used a checklist and he's an astronaut. So make sure you use your checklist, create them, update them, customize them, and use them. So what about an open OR? So I don't mean open air. I mean, what about your operating room culture? Now, I'm fortunate to have worked in a lot of different countries with different attitudes to how the hierarchy and so on works. But your operating room culture is what will save the day when trouble emerges, prevents trouble emerging in the first place, and will cultivate a team that's constantly on the lookout for improvement and safety. Deformity surgery particularly is incredibly complex, and I think we typically underestimate the cognitive load applied to us when we do it. Excuse me. That manifests in various ways. Some of us are quiet, some of us talk a lot, some of us shout, some of us will do all three. But I reckon in an average deformity case, like a proper one, we're making 400 or 500 decisions through the case in, say, a 2 to pelvis correction. Is that screw good? Is it bad? Do I let the resident do this or not? That was a lot of blood. Do I need to change my trajectory? Think how many individual decisions you make. And you're making those under pressure and in an environment of great risk. This work from Rona Flynn talks about how we are making decisions in the operating room as surgeons under that amount of pressure. And through a variety of qualitative and quantitative methods, so mixed methodology at 4 major centers, they've come up with this idea that we use 4 different tactics to make decisions when we're under pressure. And make no mistake, we are always under pressure, and fundamentally all our brains are the same. So we are all doing this, however much of a genius or not you feel you are. We're either using intuition. We're going, I've seen this, I know this, I know what to do. If I see X, I do Y. Occasionally, maybe we're going, I know that in this situation, the evidence and the books and the teaching is that we do Y. A good example of that is when we lose MEPs, we follow the grid that the SRS hands out every 5 years or so and updates, and we do Y. We release the deformity, we boost the blood pressure, we check the hemoglobin, make sure the leads are intact, we turn the music off, and that sort of thing control the room. Sometimes we're doing analytical comparison, and this might be something in perhaps a lower pressure situation. You might go, hey, I know my options are X, Y, and Z for any given situation. I'll mull them over, have a think. I'll action, option R. And lastly, and on occasion, we're coming up with creative solutions. We're thinking, well, hey, how could I get myself around this? And, some of our senior most colleagues are those surgeons who think of creative solutions to get themselves out of trouble. I've heard one today about using cervical screws in the pedicles to get yourself out of trouble, which seems mad to me, but apparently that's an option. So, there are different ways of solving these problems. However, this research from Dr. Flynn suggests that we very rarely do creative things. We're always doing a variation of something we already know. We tend not to use rule-based stuff. As I say, the exception is probably the neuromonitoring where we should be, but we tend not to use rule-based stuff. We tend to go, I've seen this before, or I've seen my mentor do this before, or my options are hook, wire, go up an extra level. I think I'll do a hook today. But the common thing in all of them is this situational assessment. And if you read deeply into this paper, you'll see that that is the common thread to all these decision routes when you're faced with a risky situation where safety is being compromised. And so you need detailed situational assessment. And through their focus groups and the interviews in this paper, that is the common theme that comes up the most. Now, you can't possibly maintain 100% situational awareness in your operating room at all times over an 8-hour deformity case when you're teaching, people are in and out, you need X-ray, you're dealing with anesthesia, and so on. So you need people to speak up. So you need to cultivate a culture in your operating room that encourages that. You might sit there and go, well, everybody's friendly in my operating room. We're all mates and we all shake our hands and pat our backs, and we all get on very well. But I can tell you, when you are face down and yelling and very focused on the task at hand, you as a surgeon are in the middle of the whole thing, and people don't want to talk to you because their view is that you're being you're focused on the job, you're working very hard and engaged in what you're doing, and you shouldn't be distracted. I know, I was a nurse for a while. You don't disturb the doctor when they're focusing. You need to overcome that. And the barriers to challenging were identified by Patney. And they're multifactorial. There are lots of them, and they vary culture to culture, of course, and institution to institution. But common themes are really that there's a hierarchical climate. It is what it is. Sometimes we, as what you might term leaders in that situation, have pretty poor interpersonal communication skills, and I don't think you can blame us. We've got lots going on. We're absorbing a lot of information. Our bandwidths are very full. We're not always the best at welcoming, interaction. There is an identified problem with gender differences in the operating room. Whether we like it or not, the reality is we're increasingly appreciating that, and we need to be very mindful of it. I'm aware that that is the lowest rank on our levers for change arrow earlier on, that we just need to be mindful of it, but I can't think of a way of putting a barrier in the way of that. And we need to make sure that people have adequate training and voicing concerns. Again, training, not that helpful. So we as surgeons need to climb that arrow and start thinking, how are we going to overcome this? So how are you going to address it in ASD surgery? Well, here's an interesting thing. So anesthesiologists typically have a lot more time on their hands during the day. And when they're not doing crosswords and Sudoku, it seems that they're thinking about these problems and observing us. And there's a new World Congress of Anesthesiology coming in 2024, and one of the papers being presented is talking about speaking up in the operating room and how to escalate concerns. So these guys out of Canada and Colombia have come up with some ideas and tools that we can furnish to our operating room staff to help them overcome that hierarchy, the gender difference, and our poor communication skills. And they've come up with these tools. The first one seems a bit screamy to me, and they called it the cuss tool, which seems a bit harsh, but about escalating the severity of the concern that anybody has. And you can see here they've gone from marking on the wrong side to saying, I am scared that you are going to do the wrong operation here, full stop. And we need to be aware that the word scared means, okay, I've got to stop and give this person 2 minutes of my time to figure out what's going on. The second tool is this pace tool, which seems a bit more user-friendly to me, and it's just allowing questions to be asked of you when you're in the operating room. Okay, and not responding in a way that, dismisses that at all. I know it seems obvious, we've all heard it, and I'm no doubt we've all thought of it before. But these are very conscious things that when somebody says to you, I am scared of this, I'm going to stop. When someone says reconfirm, I'm going to stop. The last one, the 5-step advocacy, our worry is a little bit drawn out for more urgent situations. But again, it's about slowly building that rapport with somebody in the operating room that could save the day. We had an incident in Britain many years ago in Wales where a consultant, which is an attending in Britain, was actually explanted the wrong kidney on a patient. And the only person who realized was the medical student who had taken the history from the patient in the build up to surgery, but she didn't feel able to question the consultant operating. And so another event occurred, and you can imagine how that went. And so even the least ranked person in that room can be valuable and should be welcome to speak. And it's down to you to make that happen, to use these tools if you need to, and to open the door to that. This is a sort of operating room you want, a nice smiley operating room with everybody talking and with Dr. Minshew explaining how it is to the trainees there. Everybody with a free flow of ideas, nobody nervous to share their thoughts or ask the questions. None of us would dream of being a surgeon who describes themselves as, I'm not willing to answer questions, nor should we. But that should extend right the way through to the safety of our operating. So thirdly is about discussions. So my view is that pooling expertise is absolutely central to what we do. In deformity surgery, with all the will in the world, the most number of cases we're ever going to do in a year is maybe 50 or 60. If we're very lucky, we have a great team, maybe more than that, but it's a physically demanding sport. That means that to accumulate experience for us takes a lot longer than, say, the hip guys or the guys doing subdurals and so on. If you're a neurosurgeon, I don't know, I'm not a neurosurgeon. I imagine you do lots of those. You should be discussing all your cases with your colleagues, both up and down the rank ladder, because sometimes you will be missing the obvious. We've all seen those exam cases where they show a chest x-ray, but the arm is missing. The same thing can apply in spine surgery. And it's very easy to miss the obvious spina bifida or the obvious segmentation defect and so on. So you should show them. You should also open your door to considering the alternative treatments. It may be that your strategy with a 3-column osteotomy, multi-level Pontes, and T2 to pelvis is a bit of overkill. And it may be that someone's experience could yield a safer, more easily planned route to reaching the same goals. Of course, our learning never stops. And although learning and training is some way down the hierarchy of safety improvements, it is still on there. So mining our senior partners and our experienced colleagues for their wisdom and learning from their mistakes rather than our own is a far greater, or is a far better way to do it than making your own mistakes and looking back from your future self. Otto von Bismarck had his own issues back in 18th and 19th and early 20th century Germany, but he did say the wise thing that, only a fool learns from his own mistakes. A wise man learns from the mistakes of others, and we've all said it and thought it. But it really does, it really is critical when you're thinking about the safety of your patient. If somebody else's patient has already suffered that safety error and there's a lesson to be learned, it's your responsibility to go and learn it. There's loads of ways of tackling these discussions, and they're called various things around the world. We call them boards or rounds. Over in Europe, they're the multidisciplinary team and so on. And the Fisher group here showed that when you're analyzing the outcomes of patients, and they looked at 263 deformity patients, after you've discussed them in the MDT, there's lower blood loss, fewer complications, fewer delayed extubations, low incidence of massive blood loss, fewer surgical site infections, and reoperation at 30 days and readmission at 90 days all drop significantly just through the act of discussing them in a multidisciplinary meeting with your colleagues and the wider team, so including anesthesia, radiology, the nursing staff, and so on. Similar results were seen in Seattle, excuse me, who looked at 140 complex spine patients and found if you talk about them in a multidisciplinary team meeting, the relative risk of significant complication, including cardiovascular problems, infections, implant failures, and so on, is 0.49. You are potentially reducing the risk of harm to your patient by half just by discussing them in a forum specific to complex spine. They did also show a trend towards lower mortality, but that didn't reach significance. And Dr. Sethi's paper, Dr. Sethi is a great person, that showed that they saved nearly $400,000 a year in complications, even taking into account the cost of attending the meeting. They had 3 surgeons. They discussed 108 patients over the year with 104 minutes of total kind of person time dedicated to each patient. They costed all that out, found that complications reduced by 51% and still saved just under $400,000 a year. So if your institution is saying it's not worth it, it's not worth the time, it's not worth the value, you can say, hey, actually, it is. Not only are we saving complication, but we're saving a lot of money as well, which we can then reinvest into other things, of course. So there's good evidence out there that just discussing the patients alongside the education for yourself, alongside you learning the wisdom from our senior colleagues, and of course, passing your wisdom on to our junior colleagues is incredibly effective. And all it costs is arranging a meeting and sitting and showing your x-rays. There's some work here from Wallace and Baird, who conducted another mixed method study in 2014 out of Southampton in Britain, showing how these MDT discussions can be built to be most productive. They looked at 55 weeks of meetings for 12 different teams in chronic diseases. And although we don't tend to think of it like that, adult spine deformity is a chronic disease. They conducted interviews, looked at medical records, looked at the outcomes of the patients, and they ended up with 3,184 patients discussed, with just over 2,500 treatments planned. And they ironed all this out and filtered all the data, came up with a list of things that make these MDTs effective. And I've picked out some that I think are most relevant for us here. Your chairperson shouldn't just be the person who's free that day. That individual needs to be trained in chairing skills. How do they run an efficient, effective meeting, and so on. Teams should agree ahead of time what information needs to be presented. having a meeting when you go, I don't know the latest hemoglobin, or I don't know their CONUT score for nutrition, or I don't know their pelvic incidence is not acceptable. Once you've established the objectives, you've got to audit it. So there's some work there in making sure your MDTs continue to be productive, regardless of how they develop over time. You need to review the objectives of the team meeting every year to make sure that everything's covered properly and that you're not missing opportunities to discuss given patients, or you're not cutting people out of the discussion. You need to audit the implementation. Are they actually happening with regularity? Do people know they're happening, and so on? And everything needs to be recorded electronically. And they do stipulate electronically, interestingly, given it was a decade ago now in Britain, where it was still a bit hit and miss whether we had electronic records across the NHS. You need to document the outcome of those discussions. It's something that I've taken to doing with our rounds here. And I must say, it does crystallize your thoughts when it comes to planning your treatment. At Duke, we're right on the edge of initiating a deformity-specific meeting alongside a wider spine meeting. And as part of that, I've been investing time just creating what I've called the terms of reference. What are we going to do? Why are we going to do it? Where are we going to do it? Who's invited? How are we going to record things? So that everybody walks in that room knowing precisely what's expected of them and what the outcomes are likely to be and how that's going to be recorded. It does all, of course, depend on the big man allowing us to do it, but he says he will. And it's a great example of Dr. Shafri, our chair of our division, has a wealth of knowledge to share, and this is an opportunity to mine it from him. Okay. The last one I'd like to talk about, or the last potential improvement that I'd like to think about, is debriefing. Despite what we all think, there is no such thing as the perfect operation. I know we all know it, but it takes something to say that there is something to learn from every case, and something goes less than perfect in every case, even if it's just the turnover of your operating room. Debriefing is really critical. We've known this for a long time, going back again to the late 90s. But this is quite an interesting paper out of the Netherlands in BMJ Open from 2017, who looked at, this team looked at 2.5 years of pre and post-operative briefings specific to orthopedic and neurosurgery, as well as general surgery. And they found that the briefings, as they interviewed people afterwards and looked at the data, had a positive influence on the team. Not sure what that means, but I would suggest it means everybody's happy and feeling that it's an open operating room. The efficiency of the operating rooms improved somewhat because people knew what was expected and when. And interestingly, the actual operating time per case reduced significantly. I didn't quite offer an explanation for that, but I would suggest it's because everybody knew what they were doing, what was expected, and had opportunities to ask questions beforehand rather than during a case. There's then some more data from the excellently named Joe DiMaggio Hospital in Florida, who wrote some work for the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation. And they went on to show that debriefing, of course, improves communication, not just within surgeons as the discussions do, but across disciplines. So sharing of that learning and so on occurred across disciplines. It provides a means for practice improvement. Of course it does. We sit there and identify the bad things first on every occasion, don't we? And it assures that equipment, personnel, and technology issues are identified and addressed. But all this is going to only occur if debriefs are engaged upon meaningfully. Okay, it is no good doing the quick flash briefing that we all want to do because we want to get out of a long case. So yeah, everything was great. See you tomorrow. You need some leadership with these things. Early, aggressive senior engagement. And that doesn't mean the charge nurse, that means you standing there and driving that debriefing forwards. It's only going to come back and improve the safety for your patient, the outcomes for your patients, and ultimately your ability to enjoy what you do for a living. Ideally, you have somebody with experience with quality improvement to an extent. We all do by the nature of the work that we're doing. You need to be very visible in doing it. And one way to do it is to mandate it across your organization. If it has to be done, it will be done. And think right back to the start here with that arrow of influencing change in patient safety. If you can't leave the room until it is done full stop, or there's trouble in one way or another, then you will do it. And maybe it takes that to make you and your colleagues exercise a good debrief. We're bringing about a culture of safety with the debriefing, and this is bringing us almost all the way back full circle to the very start. If you are breeding a culture of safety, whatever that looks like, always asking almost out loud, what is going to make this case more safely? Then you're empowering everybody and you're leveling the playing field. By that, I mean everybody shares that drive then. You then can offer feedback on the debriefing issues as you, as the team leader, head out and solve some of these problems that you encounter in those debriefs time and time again. If anesthesia say, hey, do you know what? We're always missing a drip stand. Hey, do you know what? Our lines are always too short because you always tuck the arms rather than abduct and extend them. Then you can go and solve that issue or at least help drive it, or drive the solution rather. It then offers an opportunity to overcome challenges. Okay, if you're losing support as a surgeon or your team's losing support, you can deal with that. If there's some breakdowns in communication within your operating room between pre and post-op or between the PACU area, you can fix that straight away. And you can early on identify areas of disillusionment. Is there someone in your team who's just not feeling it for one reason or another? You need to jump on that because they're the person who's going to see a problem and not identify it. Of all of these, this group here identified really feedback on the debriefing issues as the most key. It is no good doing all of this debriefing and so on, only for the problems that have been raised to not be discussed again and no solutions be offered. How quickly do you think those debriefs would die on their feet? Within a week is my bet. So if we go on and identify problems in the debrief, then we as surgeons need to make sure that feedback is offered and solutions are brought up. Even if that's delegating it to anesthesia or the charge nurse or the head nurse in pre-op, it's our responsibility to feed that back. It's our team. And if you want to be blunt about it, if something goes wrong with that patient, it's going to come back on you. So you should be solving that issue. But you're not going to know about it unless you debrief. And if it happens again, well, it's too late. You missed the opportunity. Initiating debriefs can be hard. At the end of a long case, particularly, certainly in my OR, there's lots of things happening at once. Neuromonitoring are wrapping up. Anesthesia are planning to, extubate and where they're going to discharge them to. The reps bring in about 800 giant silver carts and start loading trays up and so on. You need to work with them, develop some teamwork and communication, energize your leadership so that you can take charge and standardize how you deliver that debrief. The trolleys don't come until we've debriefed, guys. You can't have your discussion about discharge, about your destination post-op until we've debriefed, guys. Use the QIP tools, the quality improvement tools that your institution will have to then address the flaws in the system. It's no good fighting the system. You won't get anywhere. Use the quality improvement tools. That's what they're there for. You can delegate those if you want to your trainees. But as these issues come up, use the tools that are already there so you're not overburdening yourself. You're already doing the debrief. You found the problems. Use the quality improvement tools to save them. You then need to operationalize it. That's an English spelling with the S. Apologies. All members need to participate. We've said that earlier on, right the way from the reps through to neuromonitoring and so on. People talk about recording the debrief electronically in pace. Conducting the debrief electronically on paper or in person. I think most of us would agree in the operating room, in person is going to work the best. We're all in the same place already. So why not? But, if a particular event occurs, a cardiac arrest or a severe neurologic injury, then an electronic or a paper debrief might be the way to go and discuss things on an email chain or with a facilitator and so on via an electronic medium. That might enable some of your less vocal colleagues to speak up a little more. And they may have a solution or they may have noticed something that could have saved a world of pain. So I've spent quite a bit of time just sharing my thoughts on safety, having worked quite a bit in it in the early phases of the patient safety movement, and now reaching a stage in my career where I'm very conscious of it, with the responsibility for the patient's well-being being on my shoulders much of the time. I've told you what I think the answer is to begin with, which is always a mistake because most of you will have then dozed off. I've talked about 4 things that I plan on working on during my next 12 months here at Duke University. And my plan is really getting even safer. And it's a journey that, as I'm sure you can appreciate, will never stop. And there's always a way to get safer. So I think the answer is not to do safer things, but to be the safer surgeon. And always say to yourself, what would the safer surgeon do in this situation? You need to develop these safe habits through that cue, stimulus, reward, and so on process that we talked about. And it's worth reading the book about how to modify your habits. I found it quite helpful. and always listen to the future you. And this is what AI thinks I'm going to look like in 10 years. I got to say, I think that's quite the change. But I'm trying to listen to him in 10 years' time and say, hey, what do I wish I'd done or hadn't done that year in 2024 when I was working at Duke? Thanks very much for your attention, guys. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, either now or later on. But thanks again, and thanks again to VGSC for all the education you've shared us over the last few years.
Brett, I don't know if you can hear me or not. I was having a little trouble with reception here, but
Oh, no problem.
fantastic talk. Thank you for sharing that. That's certainly the part about checklists is something I've done in a different way, and I'm actually going to probably steal some of those ideas. I think that was just very well done, and something, a lot of things we can probably all be doing a little better. Thanks for giving that talk.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, and yeah, I'm happy to share anything you feel is valuable with you. Definitely. But, you know, make the key is to make them work for you. I think, you know, just plucking them from those that are published almost always becomes a bit of a burden. But finding a way that works for the way you practice and the way you think, you know, is key. And, you know, I always forget the little things. I find I'm pretty good at the big things, but taping my nose and with the mask so the thing doesn't mist up, or, you know, making sure that I can lift the microscope high enough and I'm not right under the light pillar and so on. All these things compromise my ability to look after a patient safely. So it's small things that are specific that make a difference.
100%. I actually agree 100%. It's the small things that I like to I actually use a big sheet in the operating room that I write on in the morning, and it lists everything from, every step of the day, including things like final tightening. And,
Yeah.
we had a case the other day in a different room where it didn't get final tightened and had to come right back. And, little things like that tend to happen that kind of validate the process, because you always want to, at least in my view, you always want to control the things you can control. And for me, it just helps me not think about them. It just becomes kind of like you said, it's just a thing you do, whether it's going to the office in the morning with your checklist or in the OR. It's certainly helps my brain and seems to help the room as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, your one case next door going back for final tightening. I mean, how much did that cost? How much harm to the patient and so on there for want of a paper checklist potentially? I think you're going about it the right way, to my mind.
Agreed. Well, thank you again.
No problem. My pleasure. So I can see Elizabeth. How should I ask team members if they have or need a checklist or assistance building one? I think the evidence is there to show that these things work. I found it very motivating to find some of my own individual heroes relied on checklists from the start. And that was the day I thought, hey, if Buzz Aldrin needed it, I need it. Some people are very data driven. So it's very clear, Haynes 2009, the WHO checklist works. Kulkarni 2017, spine checklists work. There's this in black and white, well-designed work that proves that it's effective. Or on a more personal level, hey, the great humans of history used checklists, or just leading by example. Here's my checklist book. I leave it all over the place. I'm sure all my colleagues have seen it, and I hope some of them have derived some benefit from that and gone away and gone, hey, maybe I should do a checklist too. I think you've got to tailor it to the individuals, but just ask the question, hey, do you have a checklist just, for the end of a complex case when you're tired and worn out and so on? Or do you have a checklist you make your fellows follow at the end? Those might be some ways to broach it. But ultimately, it's down to your style and theirs, I think. I get away with a lot with my accent, so I think that helps. Well, I think we can draw the event to a close then. Thanks so much for joining us today and for listening. And please do get in contact if there's anything you feel like I might be able to help you with, or if you'd like to. I'm very happy to share the checklists I've been using. They are work in progress, but there's no secrets there. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, evening, morning, or lunchtime, wherever you are in the world. And thanks very much for joining us.